Hello, Shadowcat back, and I need to get something off my chest. Because when I'm not spending my time playing games and trying to produce the various series that I have on this channel, I spend a lot of my time keeping up on current events, watching the way the world is turning, and just generally trying to keep ahead of things. I watch the news, I follow trends, that kind of thing. And there's a trend going on in the world right now that I I need to get it off my chest. I need to say something about this because I don't hear anyone else talking about it and it needs to be talked about. Before I get into that, I want to bring up something from history though, and that is the history of lynching. Now, if you're not familiar with lynching because either you're too young and have never really lived in an era where that was done, or you're just too old and forgot about it, I have a definition here. So, according to the Oxford Language Dictionary, to lynch, generally speaking of a mob, it is to kill someone, usually by hanging, for an alleged offense with or without a legal trial. Now, the thing about lynching is, when it says with or without a legal trial, well, if there was a legal trial, it wouldn't be lynching, it would be an execution. The whole point is that when you lynch someone, there is no legal system. You have decided that a person needs to die, there's more of you than there are of them, and you're just going to go ahead and do it. I mean, you could also call that an execution. Some people call that vigilante justice, but usually it refers to a mob of people who have decided that one person has done something wrong, and they decide to take the law into their own hands in a vigilante fashion, and then just simply end them. This happened a lot, especially in the US, but it probably happened a lot over the rest of the world, and I just don't know about it. But in the US, it happened a lot during the civil rights era and the decades preceding that. Pretty much the entire span of time between the Civil War and the Civil Rights era, I would call the lynching period. Because that was a time in the US where the African Americans had been freed, but they weren't given equal rights. And so they were treated as second class citizens, and that includes that they didn't have the same right to legal defense or anything else. They had the right, but it wasn't recognized. And so if an African American person, usually, I mean, there were a lot of other people that were also lynched, but usually it was an African American person, if they were accused of a crime, there was no trial needed, and there was no delay. People took action. And there's a lot of very famous cases where that happened, where there was simply an accusation made, and a person was dragged through town, pulled down the road behind a horse or a truck. They'd find a tree, string them up, and leave them there as an example to the rest of the community. An example of what? I suppose that depends on who you ask, because, well, everyone knew exactly what happened. You're not fooling anyone. I bring that up, though, because the lynching period is looked back upon now as being utterly depraved and some of the worst of humanity, at least in the US. There are things that have been worse in the world. I mean, we've had massacres and despots and things like that. But in general, this is only a few rungs below that. The only thing really keeping it down is the scale. I want to talk about that real quick just so that we have a foundation, because what I would need to get off my chest is that never went away. And some people will say, well, yeah, of course it never went away. And they'll like to bring up all kinds of modern news stories about probably police actions where, police have killed a person, or they'll go through gang violence and stuff like that. No, I don't want to do any of that. What I do want to get into is two things. Two things right now in the world that are very important. Those two things are cancel culture, the concept of it, and the current response to the COVID pandemic. And I want to bring both of those up because while the two things essentially have nothing to do with each other, they are in fact the same thing. And I'll get into that, and you can debate in the comments below whether or not I got it right or not. And, even if you want to have a conversation, that's what the comments are there for. Trust me, I read all comments. I respond to all comments. So if you leave one, I will respond to you. And we can have that back and forth. So let's take cancel culture first. When we talk about cancel culture, what we generally mean is this. Somebody does something that a group of people, whether it's a small minority or the general public at large, finds objectionable. Once they do this, there's a very predictable sequence of events afterwards. First things that the group will do is they will dox the person. Now, if you're not familiar with doxing, there's several different definitions out there. All of them are different. Let it just be said that doxing is the gathering of all private information about that person. You need their full name. You need their phone numbers. You need their address. You need their email addresses. You need their place of employment or where they go to school. You need to know what accounts they have on different websites. What are their magazine subscriptions? Every little bit of information you can get on the person. You find it and you make it public. Now, why do you do this? Well, because the next part of cancel culture is you go through and you attack the person through those vectors. You never go after the person directly. If you go after the person directly, it's really easy to file a case and call that harassment. Instead, what you do is, for whatever offense they did, you go to their place of employment. You go to their boss and you tell the business, look, you have this person who did this thing that we have deemed to be wrong. And because we have deemed it to be wrong, you have two options. You can either fire the person, or what we cannot do to them, we will do to you. Whether that is protesting outside and running off your customers, maybe even defacing your property. After all, you can't throw a rock at the person, but anyone, driving down the mall parking lot can throw a rock through a window. These things happen. So you do whatever you can to get the person fired, and then there you go, they're fired. You go to their school and tell the school, look, you either expel this person, or we'll demonstrate on your property. We'll harass the other students. Not in those words, of course, because that would be legally actionable, but that's going to be a running theme here. You want to be just below what is legally actionable, so you have that bit of protection. So you go after their job, you go after their schooling. Are they in a homeowners association? Maybe you can go to the homeowners association and get them kicked out. You can attack their digital presence. You can go to their social media, their Facebook, their Twitter, all of that, and you can spam it with all kinds of nasty things until they eventually shut it down. The end result of cancel culture is that you want to, quote-unquote, cancel a person, which is that you want to make it impossible for them to function in the general public. Now, this, I wanted to liken back to lynching because it is like the inverted image of lynching. Whereas lynching, you would take a person and you would attack that person and take out all of your anger on the person themselves. Cancel culture, you do the opposite. You target the entire community around them. And if you do it right, the end result is the community itself exiles the person for you. It's like outsourcing the lynching to a third party. You get them fired so they don't have a job. No job means no income. Or you get them removed from school. No school means that whatever career path they were on, well, now it's gone. If they don't have their career and they don't have their job, they don't have money. If they don't have money, then they can't pay bills and they can't buy food. The end result is that one of two things is going to happen. Number one, it doesn't happen very often, but they could just starve to death. If you can't buy food, then how do you live? You can't. And that's the point. You make it impossible for the person to live. If they're in a homeowners association and you get them kicked out of the homeowners association, now they're homeless. How long can they keep a job up if they're homeless? I mean, granted, lots of people have done it. We see stories about people who go from homeless to, living the white picket fence life just because they worked extra hard, but those cases are, the oddity. Most people, if they're homeless, they don't last very long having a job. It's just too hard. So if you can target their employment or their housing, you can essentially get them excised from the community. You can target their social media and drive them off of that. If you get 1,000 messages a day, every single day, about how awful you are, most people will simply stop showing up. They'll turn off their Facebook account. They'll turn off their Twitter. And just like that, whatever they might have said online is gone. You didn't have to go through and get them removed. You got them to remove themselves. And now you no longer need to hear them. It is the same result with just a slightly more roundabout way to get there. Instead of removing the problem yourself, you force them to remove themselves. Once upon a time, we did have something similar to this, and it was shaming. Shaming was something that used to be a very big deal because most people at least had a certain amount of pride and respect that they wanted to uphold in themselves and their community. And if somebody did something that was particularly egregious, you could shame them. But at the same time, we also understood that these things had to have limits. You don't just shame somebody to shame them. No, you do something when they have done something that is actively destructive to themselves or destructive to the community in some way. And these things were generally agreed upon by the community, which was only possible because we had communities. Obviously, a bigger problem here is that we no longer have communities at all, but that is a completely different tangent that I'm not going to get into right now. No, we have turned those tactics into a weapon that we can use. So now, if somebody so much as expresses the wrong political opinion online, you can go to their employer and say, "Did you know that you have this person working for you? And here's a list of all the bad things about this person because they happen to be affiliated with this party that I don't like, or this religion that I don't like, or even just this club that I don't like. Because they're a part of this, they embody all of these things that I don't like. And by the way, if you're going to continue to employ this person, then by association, you embody all those things that I don't like. And I have friends that agree with me. So make it easy on yourself and just fire the person." This is cancel culture. It's the equivalent of seeing a person, not even seeing a person, having a boat. Say a boat. You have a boat, and there's like 10 people on there, and one of these people needs to go. So you all just keep kind of backing up towards the stern of the boat. And you keep pushing that person back as you're doing it. No one's touching them. But you all just keep backing up until the person falls in the water. No one did anything. But once they fall in the water, well, now all you have to do is just not help them up. And the problem is gone. You don't actually have to lift a finger, and you still get what you want. Not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea. You just get to remove people. And there you go. So that's one parallel that I wanted to make and why it's a big problem, because we see this every single day in the modern world. Every day there is some story about some person who is getting canceled. And why are they getting canceled? Well, it's not because they did anything, usually. It's because they happen to believe in something. Take, for example, J.K. Rowling, famed author of the Harry Potter series. She has opinions on transgenderism, and because of that, they have done everything they can to remove her from her own movies. Why? Because they don't like her. They don't like what she thinks, what she believes. Not that she actually did anything. They just don't like her. And so they have to purge the unclean. That was one of the parallels that I wanted to make. Along the same vein, I want to talk about the COVID pandemic and more importantly, the response to it. Because we are now 2 years in on this. And all the people that basically said, look, it's bad, but we're all going to pull together and we'll be over this in a few months. Yeah, that never happened. And as a matter of fact, it's only gotten worse. Not the pandemic, mind you. The pandemic is pretty much over at this point. The case numbers are down compared to what we started with. The symptoms are down, the death toll is down, everything is down except for the response to it. The response to it continues to ratchet up every single day. We see it in the United States, we see it in Canada, we see it in Europe, we see it in the Philippines, we see it in Australia. All of them to varying degrees, but all ratcheting up in the same direction. The latest news to come out of some of these nations and regions is they are instituting stay-at-home orders again. They're saying that people who are unvaccinated, because they are unvaccinated, are no longer allowed to leave their homes, except usually in a couple of very specific instances. You are only allowed to leave your house generally to either seek medical attention or to buy food. Those are the only exceptions. You're not allowed to go outside for exercise, you're not allowed to go outside for fresh air, you're not allowed to go to the store, you're not allowed to do anything. It's either food or medical attention. Think about that for a minute, and see if you can spot a small problem there. I'll give you a second. You think about it? Okay. You can't work. If you can't work, if you can do nothing productive, then where do you get the money to go buy food or to get medical attention? See, this is the subtle underlying purpose of all these lockdown measures. It's not about protection. It's about dividing and removing a segment of the population. Much as cancel culture targets a single person to make it impossible for them to live by taking away their job, taking away their home, taking away their media, taking away their communication with others, until that person either dies or removes themselves from the region and goes somewhere else. The COVID response has been cancel culture on a mass scale. Because when the government comes out and says that you are no longer allowed to work, no work means no money. No money means that you are not going to be able to feed yourself and you will not be able to house yourself. The only difference is that when a person is canceled and they're forced to leave, they can pack up whatever belongings they can carry, throw them in a car, and drive. They could drive forever until they find a new place where they can start over. But the response to the COVID pandemic has been unavoidable. See, when it's the government that comes down and says, well, you cannot work, you can't just get in your car and drive. Because they've said you're not allowed to. If you're caught driving and you're unvaccinated, then they'll say that you have breached a policy or a quarantine or whatever, and then you're subject to arrest. So you're not allowed to leave. You're not allowed to work either. Your options are getting very narrow. Your options are either to fall in line, regardless of what your circumstances might be, or to simply sit there and wait for starvation to take you. Either that or take the easy way out. But they don't want to mention that. Both of these things go back to lynching. Why? Because it's been brought from a group of people, a mob, whether it's a mob of civilians or a mob of officials. It's being enacted without trial, without any kind of legal pushback, and the end result is ultimately the same either way. You want to remove these people from your community. And they're doing a pretty good job of it too. Because in places like the Philippines or Australia, they've actually started to go around and start removing the people. They have what they're calling quarantine centers. Although if you do any searching on the internet at all, you can find some very creative and reused names from about 80 years ago or so. Give or take a couple years. The end result, though, is the same. And that's what I needed to get off of my chest, because I see it happening, but no one's talking about it. Now, whether they're not talking about it because they don't see it, or whether they don't talk about it because they're afraid of the response to it, regardless of any of that, it needs to be said. What is going on now with both cancel culture and the COVID response is a modern-day lynching. It is perpetrated by groups that are pretending to be either victims of whatever the behavior is, or they're pretending to do it in your best interest, but the result is still the same. And so now I leave this to you, and hopefully you keep this in mind for when you're watching the news, or you're reading the articles on the internet, you're going on the Twitter or the Facebook, any of those. Keep this in mind. Whenever you see one of those articles is talking about whatever new measures are being taken, a vaccine mandate, a vaccine pass, a requirement for shots or masks or anything else out there, whenever there is something that will divide the populace, that says either you do this or you're out, look at this again in the terms of not just what does it take to be included in the community, but who are we instead pushing out because of it? Because once upon a time, yeah, it was the one person who was being pushed out with no real legal basis and just on the angry whims of a mob. Now it's an entire section of the population. And we've seen in history what happens when you try to remove an entire section of the population. It doesn't end well, and it usually ends up as a stain on that nation forever. Except this time, it may not be a nation. This time it may be the entire world. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it there. That's just food for thought, my 2 cents. So hopefully I'll see you down in the comments later. If you've enjoyed this little diatribe of mine and want to hear more of it, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell icon for every video that I put out. Most of them are not as rough as this, but I just had to get this off of my chest, and there's no script. I just needed to say what I needed to say. If you know somebody else who could also use to hear this, make sure you share this video. Share it far and wide. I mean, there's no way that YouTube is going to share this with anyone. No, YouTube is going to flag this and probably bury it. So if you don't share it, it's not getting out there at all. Then you two can come back, whoever you shared it with, leave a like, leave a comment down below, let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in the next video. Till then, take care.